I'm gonna be honest. I thought that the zombie genre died the day that H1Z1 went full-on battle royale. I think that anyone born before the early 2000s remembers the zombie game boom of the mid-2010s. DayZ, the mod for Arma 2, released in 2012 and had reached 1 million players within the first 4 months. Right about then, I think, is when the zombie game floodgates opened. Now this, of course, isn't to say that the zombie genre didn't exist before DayZ dropped. Dead Rising, Zombie Panic Source, and Call of Duty's zombie modes had solidified themselves as solid titles that had room for growth, but I personally believe that DayZ was the catalyst that set off the explosion of zombie games that ran rampant from around 2010 to 2016 or so. Now, while plenty of quality games have come from this boom, like 7 Days to Die, The Last of Us, State of Decay, for every one of these solid titles, there were 5 or 6 knee-jerk games that tried to copy the now successful zombie survival formula, and they tried to make a quick buck off this new craze, but were shallow, or blatant cash grabs, or not nearly properly quality tested, or some combination of the three. Now, I, admittedly, being a young impressionable high schooler around this time, bought into the notion that the zombie genre, ironically, was dead and didn't touch a similarly themed game, with the rare exception, for many years. That changed when, about a month ago, I decided to read the Walking Dead comic series. I ADHD laser-focused, finished all roughly 180 issues over the span of 2 weeks, and went down a bit of a rabbit hole, seeing if there were any really solid zombie-themed titles that I had put blinders on noticing over the past years. And as it turns out, there were.
He's just like Tom and Jerry, bro.
Man, Sir Top Hat's getting boxed up.
Oh, no.
In retrospect, I really do believe that the zombie genre is one of the most versatile genres that a developer can work with. It provides a solid baseline that makes for a really good blank canvas to turn into whatever gaming experience you want to make. Let's take, for example, 2 very different zombie games, Telltale's The Walking Dead and Dying Light. The former, in my opinion, is a narrative masterpiece and provides a deeply woven web of human interactions interspersed within a zombie apocalypse. This game is the first, and one of the only games, that has ever made me cry. Dying Light, on the flip side, is a wide-open sandbox that gives the player a ton of choice regarding how they survive in the apocalypse. They can play a mobile build that's an expert in moving point to point, or they can play a combat-oriented, in-your-face style build that wields all sorts of technological monstrosities. We'll cover both of these games in a little bit, but I really do believe that the zombie genre can be one of the most multifaceted foundations from which to build a game, providing, of course, that the developer is able to make it stand out from the slog of zombie shovelware that litters platforms like Steam. I was recently streaming and was talking about how I had found some really solid zombie titles that I was enjoying when one of my friends asked me, "What's your idea of a great zombie game?" Now, I know this isn't a video that's naturally going to be relevant or agreeable to everyone, but that question is something that stuck with me for a few days, so I said, screw it. I have 12 subscribers, the sky's the limit. We only make big moves on this channel, folks. So grab Lucille, get ready to bash some walkers or freakers or Zeds or whatever quirky name your IP wants to call them, and let's make the ideal zombie game. Building our game, I think it'll be best to use some other games as a framework. So throughout the rest of the video, what I'm going to do is take some of my favorite standout zombie titles, borrow what I think works, and at the end, we'll put it all together into our own little concoction. The first game that I'm going to borrow from here is Undead Labs' State of Decay 2, released in 2018. Being the only games in Undead Labs' development history, they've had years to perfect both State of Decay titles on top of the third State of Decay that's in development as of now. State of Decay 2 is equal parts zombie survival and colony management. Undead Labs did a good job of striking a solid balance between going out, fighting zombies, scrounging resources and all that, alongside managing your colony, crafting new items for your survivors, and managing their jobs and stats. In my opinion, no other game out there walks the line between what normally would be two separate games this well. Look at, for example, how the base management works. Resources in State of Decay 2 come in two different forms: items and resources. For example, looking at medicine. You find painkillers, bandages, and first aid kits, all of which help heal your characters, but you can also find the medicine resource, which is found in large rucksacks. Your colony consumes a little bit of resources like medicine, food, and fuel every day. So, on top of finding items to gear out your survivors and help them in combat, you also need to find these resources in their rucksack form to help keep your colony running. I personally enjoy this system. It incentivizes you to go out into places you otherwise wouldn't, which helps create tense situations this genre is so well known for. Sure, I wouldn't normally trudge into the middle of this infested town, but our colony's low on food, so on we go. Part of what I'm guessing is difficult for developers when making a game is to create compulsory situations that don't feel like a chore. In other games, resource grinding is just as necessary as in State of Decay 2, but it isn't nearly as exciting or noteworthy. When it comes time for me to find dihydrogen in No Man's Sky, it's boring. When it comes time for me to find food in State of Decay 2, it's not boring. I think this is where the zombie genre as a whole lends itself to benefit players in situations like these. What would be a regular resource grind becomes a challenge because the stakes are higher. Granted, while resource hunting may be tense and challenging at lower levels, once you get later into the game it becomes much less nerve-wracking once you get access to guns, even more so when silencers and crossbows come into play. I think that this is something that our ideal zombie game would need to be cautious of. While it makes sense for small encounters to become increasingly easy as our survivors become more seasoned, the zombies as a whole should still find ways to present a challenge to the player. The looting and scavenging side of the game is also done well in my opinion. Loot is randomized, but in a way that makes sense. Going to hospitals nets you painkillers and bandages. Going to hardware stores nets you materials and facility mods. Going to surplus stores nets you guns and ammo. The overworld tends to have places that favor one resource more than others, which can create some good situations. I spent a good amount of time moving bases and clearing out a whole section of the map, but this section didn't give me the resources my colony needed. At first, I would just make supply runs with the cars where we needed to go, but by doing this, we burnt through our fuel reserves. This resource scarcity forces the player to keep a nomadic playstyle early on. As the game goes on, the player can place outposts at buildings which give the group certain benefits. Building one at hospitals gives bonus medicine every day. Building one at a landmark outpost gives the ability to call for sniper support. Building one somewhere far from your base allows you to switch colonists and take resources from your main base storage from a great distance away. I like the outpost system because it gives the player some flexibility. You can move bases to an area that doesn't have much in the way of medicine, but because we have an outpost at a hospital, we don't need to worry about that. This system helps you get more entrenched as the game goes on. I spent the last third or so of my campaign in one base because I favored putting outposts on resources. All in all, I think State of Decay 2 is a great example of how a zombie game can be done well on both a micro scale and a macro scale, and that gives it some really good pieces we can put in our game. Let's move on to the next one. I am of the opinion that the Walking Dead series by Telltale is a narrative masterpiece. Not even just in that the series features good storytelling, which it does, but also because it uses something called the illusion of choice so well. The Snakerer has a really good video on this concept that I would wholeheartedly recommend if you're in a situation like mine, where you played these games a long time ago but never really picked up on just how little choice the player has on the overarching story. Keep in mind that I'm specifically referring from here on out to the first game in the series, as I strongly think this was the best of the 5 games that Telltale released under the Walking Dead IP. The Walking Dead is just as much a people game as it is a zombie game. What drives the story is not the zombies, but rather how the player chooses to interact with the people in the wake of them. That's obviously not to say that the zombies aren't a threat in the series, but out of all the games that I'm going to pick from for this video, Telltale's The Walking Dead is by far the most human-centric one of the bunch. Telltale was known for its ability to weave a good story into almost any IP, with games not just in the Walking Dead universe, but also in those of Borderlands, Game of Thrones, Batman, Sam & Max, and Guardians of the Galaxy. In terms of gameplay, The Walking Dead is essentially just a point-and-click game with WASD movement. If I were to take anything from the series, it would be the writing. I don't want to spoil the story for those of you who haven't played it, so I'll let the Metacritic scores speak for themselves. Obviously, you shouldn't just take a review at face value, but it's difficult to talk about the effectiveness of this game's storytelling without spoiling it. One facet that I can talk about is the game is written such that you only really have a short few choices that really affect how the game ends. That's that illusion of choice that I was talking about earlier. Telltale was good at writing heartfelt stories, but they were also really good at writing stories such that the player thinks the choices they make matter relative to the main plot. Doing this successfully is a twofold win. The player thinks that they've made a substantive choice, and the developers don't need to add a whole other story arc for every decision the player makes. Revisiting Telltale's various games has also re-revealed to me how good they were at creating games with difficult choices, regardless of their effect on the main plot or the lack thereof. In a lot of games, developers will tout about how their story is branching and offers many different ways to handle interactions, but I think that these are a lot more hollow and less interesting.
Fallout.
If you're here to talk me into working on Liberty Prime, you can forget it.
Do I need to remind you why you made that promise in the first place?
No, that won't be necessary. Tell Proctor Ingram to get her scribes ready.
Every game with story-based decisions needs to use the illusion of choice, but all too frequently games that are supposed to be narrative heavy hitters don't even appear to hide the fact that your choices don't matter. If you don't want the player to feel like they can influence the story, then that's fine, but don't tout your dialogue and story writing around like they're the king of the castle. A meaningful interaction to me is all in the setup to make an interaction that is tough even if the player knows the ins and outs of the game. When that NPC asks me to look for their kid, and I'm a level 380 with every weapon in the game, I'm not going to say no, because I know I can handle it. Strong story writers make it such that what would seem to be an easy decision can still be marred in uncertainty. Again, this all sounds very semantic and open-ended, but it's tough to talk about this without spoiling the story of a game whose main gameplay is making story decisions, so be nice to me. What I'm saying is that Telltale were great at making tough calls for the player to choose from, and I think that any game involving an apocalypse, let alone with zombies, should have conundrums like this. Picking Telltale's narrative expertise to put in our game, even if just to implement in the odd side quest or random event, would definitely be a strong tool in our game's arsenal. On to the next game. Project Zomboid is to zombie games as Dwarf Fortress is to management games. Project Zomboid has been in development since 2011, Dwarf Fortress since 2002. Both games look almost nothing like their original versions, albeit more so on the inside for Dwarf Fortress, and both games are still in active development. And on top of that, both games, still being in alpha stages, are fully playable and enjoyable. While Dwarf Fortress really is a standout on its own, we're going to focus on Zomboid from here on out. If you haven't heard of Project Zomboid, it's probably one of the best zombie survival sandboxes available. I don't usually like isometric style games, but this one was fun enough to me that it broke the mold. As of December 2021, it's just you, a town of your choice in Knox County, now Knox Country, and the undead hordes. While NPCs are being worked on, and have been for many years, and multiplayer is aimed to be released by the end of this month, I personally still have a ton of fun just on my own surviving the undead. Loneliness is something that a lot of zombie games don't tend to make a lasting factor, probably because when it's just one character it's difficult to build a compelling story. But in a sandbox game like Zomboid, The story doesn't matter, so have fun being your only advocate in the terrifying and fictional land of Kentucky. Okay, hold on, time out. So, the literal day after I finished recording all of this, Zomboid updated with multiplayer support for 16-player multiplayer servers. Now, while it's not the full 32-player support that's still being worked on, this is still proof enough that an open-world zombie sandbox like Zomboid is plenty viable for a good time in a co-op setting. Playing with other players in the Zomboid setting is a completely different experience than the single player. Going on supply runs, stealing cars, fighting hordes, which is now a possibility with multiple players, are all facets of the game that I think are really enhanced with the ability to play with friends. I personally enjoyed it a lot, but I could understand where some people would prefer the slower and more high-stakes pacing of the single player. But hey, that's the beauty of co-op. You can play the game with other players should you wish, but ultimately that choice is up to you, and the gameplay experience can be whichever you prefer. Combine that with the heavily customizable server options and you can make whatever custom possibilities you would want for your server a reality. Alright, that's enough of that, back to the video. For a game that doesn't have a set story, Zomboid is great at painting the story of your character as they make the best out of a bad situation. It becomes easy to roleplay your character as they trudge along, using a spoon as their only method of self-defense. Where I really think Zomboid excels is the presentation of the zombies themselves. A lot of zombie games, in an attempt to stand out from the others, put special zombies in their games. State of Decay has bloaters. Dying Light has demolishers, yada yada yada. While I understand that putting a new type of zombie like this in a game shakes up the playstyle and forces you to adapt and think on the fly, I think that in doing so you also neutralize the zombies themselves as a threat. Part of what makes zombies so intimidating as an enemy is the knowledge that the hundreds of shambling corpses beelining for you were regular people no different from yourself. They were neighbors, or the mailman, or your wife's boyfriend. That illusion is broken when instead of fighting the shell of a normal person, it's an 8'5" monstrosity wearing somehow still fitting SWAT gear, or a dude with a 20-foot long tongue that ensnares and traps you. Obviously, putting special zombies in your game doesn't instantly make it a bad zombie game, but I think that adding special zombies in a game takes away from how intimidating the idea of the undead horde is. Instead of being a massive pack of X people being your main concern, now it's the Lovecraftian horrors with inhuman abilities that overshadow the zombies as the main threat. It disarms the zombies in the zombie game, and frankly makes the zombies more and more tedious to deal with as time goes on. That's not to say the tedium of taking out the same undead enemies isn't common in games that just stick to regular old zombies, but good games, like Zomboid, make that process a slow burn. Adding specials to the game only accelerates it. Where Zomboid excels in this regard is that on top of keeping standard zombies as your enemies, those standard zombies stay a threat for much longer than in other games. In State of Decay 2, early on in the game, melee combat is your only method of dealing with the undead. Later on, the player gets guns. They're deadly, but also super loud and impractical. This is completely nullified once the player gets access to silencers and crossbows. At later stages of the game, when the player has a silenced weapon and an abundance of ammo, regular zombies basically stop becoming a threat. That resource grind that earlier was exciting because of the challenge is now boring and routine. Zomboid is able to subvert this by keeping the zombies deadly throughout the game. You don't learn new melee abilities, and guns, while effective, are mostly impractical. Whether you're 1 day in, or 3 years in, dealing with more than a few zombies in melee is impractical at best and dangerous at worst. There's no silencers either, which means anytime you decide to use a gun, you're rolling the dice with attracting the entire horde. Dealing with zombies in large numbers requires setting up crafty and complicated trap setups. A lot of zombie games make the zombies a non-issue later on in the game, and I think that's something our game would need to be careful of avoiding. If our game could create a zombie horde akin to that of Zomboid, I think that we would have a really solid, fleshed out antagonist to work against. Dying Light was released in 2015 and still averages about 6,000 concurrent players, which is really solid for a non-competitive title that's 6 years old, and there's a reason it still pulls these numbers. Dying Light is a compelling game with standout gameplay. If you aren't familiar with Dying Light, I don't believe you. But if you were to convince me that you aren't familiar with Dying Light, I'd tell you that its gameplay features visceral first-person melee action combined with a parkour system that gives Assassin's Creed levels of lateral and vertical freedom. While I think the argument could be made that giving the player freedom to that scale makes the Horde more benign, there's no denying that being cornered by a large group of undead and scampering up the closest building to escape by jumping rooftop to rooftop is undeniably fun. Giving the player a whole skill tree just in the movement system encourages players to use this environmental freedom to their advantage. While my version of an ideal zombie game is more structured in reality, ironic as that sounds, having an environment that enables the player to use as much of it as possible, like with Dying Light, would be highly sought after. Dying Light also excels in the variance in map design. While the game has 4 separate overworld maps, those maps have plenty of different areas that, because of the game's movement system, not only affect how they look, but also dictate how the player moves through them. This system of art direction dictating gameplay really only works in games that give the player an immense amount of freedom of movement, such as Breath of the Wild or the Battlefield series. When it works, it truly makes a game stand out. Obviously, most games are designed so that different levels require you to handle potentially similar situations differently, but not a lot of games are able to make that transition feel seamless and fluid quite like those aforementioned titles. That combined with the co-op system makes this game a good time with friends. While bleak overtones are in no short supply during the apocalypse, having a friend to play with helps add a sense of camaraderie to a game. I think that of all the games that I'll be drawing from, Dying Light is easily the fastest and most dynamic. The zombie genre, whether that be in comic, film, or game form, is nothing if not gory. Good response mechanics are ubiquitous with a good zombie game, and while all of the games we've drawn from perform well in that regard, none of them do quite as well as Dying Light. Complemented by the excellent close combat system, zombies can be beheaded, split in twain, have chunks chopped out of them, among countless other forms of damage. They can be kicked from high ledges, shot with arrows, slide tackled, and stomped. The list goes on and on. A zombie game with lackluster combat is just barely a zombie game. If it were to come down simply to how fighting the zombies feels, Dying Light is easily the strongest contender of all the games I'm drawing from. While I think I would enjoy our zombie game if it were more tense and slow-paced, I think there's lots to borrow from Dying Light, such as its open-ended and deep movement system, as well as its melee combat, gore, and general response mechanic system. Alright, one more game to go. The last game I want to draw from for our zombie game is The Walking Dead: Saints and Sinners from Skydance Interactive and Skybound Entertainment. Released in early 2020, it's the newest game of the ones we'll be covering. With this in mind, I think it's fair to expect some new and innovative systems not featured in many other zombie titles. As I'm sure you've noticed, this game is in VR. This helps the game out in a couple different ways. The first and most obvious reason is with VR, the player can feel much more immersed in the game. I think that a lot of games operate on the assumption that making a game VR means that it's automatically immersive, and that leads to a lot of VR games that feel disconnected and disjointed from a player's perspective. Luckily, this game is not one of them. One area that VR games tend to struggle with is in melee combat. Regular games don't need to worry about things like weight simulation because they can just factor that into a player's swing speed as well as the sound design. But in VR, swinging something that should be heavy, like an axe, and not feeling any resistance can be off-putting and janky. Saints and Sinners simulates weight really well. Not a lot of other games simulate weight this well, but if you've played AAA VR titles like Boneworks, Blade and Sorcery, or Half-Life Alyx, you'll recognize this system. Like we saw in Dying Light, melee combat is integral to a good zombie game, and this weight system that Saints and Sinners uses works to its benefit. VR also benefits the player through the use of gesture-based systems that help the player feel immersed. If you want to grab something from your backpack, you have to physically reach behind your head and pull out your backpack. Equipping a weapon requires you to grab it from your belt. Little interactions that typically involve pressing a single key being performed in VR makes the player feel much more invested in their character and, by extension, the game itself. With all this being said, I want our ideal zombie game to be made to reasonable expectations, and I don't think a fully fleshed out game like the one we're trying to make today would be practical to put in a completely VR setting. The technology just isn't there, for consumers anyways. Games like Half-Life Alyx are proof that quote-unquote big games can be made in VR, but for a super open-ended and strong narrative game like the one we're trying to build, I just don't think it would be reasonable to expect it to be done completely in VR. That's not to say that we can't borrow things that the game still does well, however. The atmosphere in Saints and Sinners is strong. The setting of the Louisiana Bayou looks good when it's dilapidated and worn down, kind of similar to Hunt Showdown, which I'm also a fan of. While the combat isn't exactly visceral like Dying Light's, it's certainly more personal. More times than not, the safest and most efficient way to kill a walker is to grapple it with one hand and brain it with the other. Unlike melee combat in a lot of other zombie games, which just consists of hitting and slashing, grappling and getting face to face with your target is a regular occurrence in Saints and Sinners, and this type of melee combat would do wonders for us in our zombie game. Now that we've picked some bits and pieces from some of the games that I think are best representative of the genre as a whole, it's time to build our ideal zombie game. So before we go into what elements of what game go into where in our game, let's start by just defining some of the basic facets of what our game would be. I think that our game would have the most creative freedom possible if it were a single-player RPG with light multiplayer elements. This would allow us to build a good narrative framework while still allowing for the possibility of co-op between players. State of Decay 2 does this well. The game is easily playable, single player, but features a drop-in, drop-out co-op system should players want to team up. Next up is how the game will be presented to the player. I can see advantages of both first and third person, but I personally like the idea of first person. What would normally be a routine fight between you and a few zombies would feel all the more personal on top of how much more intimidating a large horde would feel from this perspective. The next question we need to answer is, how do we want our game to be played? Do we want a more linear, narrative-driven experience like in Telltale's The Walking Dead, or something more open-ended like Techland's Dying Light? I like the idea of having regency over our player as well as any potential party members, which I think would perform best in an open world setting. Part of what makes games like Zomboid so fun is figuring out where to go and when, even if you're not sure what lies there. As far as the story in the game goes, I like the idea of a more sandbox style game, light on the story, but heavy on the world building. It would be fantastic if we could land the writing talent of Telltale staff like Sean Vanneman, who is a writer for The Walking Dead, as well as other really good games like Firewatch and Half-Life Alyx. Writers like him help with a unique challenge zombie-oriented anything faces. The world is supposed to be dead, so it becomes the mission of the writer not to breathe life into the world, but rather breathe the shadow of life into the world, writing stories of those who didn't make it or of the few who did. Now, it's easy, of course, to just use text logs or audio logs, but those are boring and uninspired methods of telling a story because they take the player out of the game. Talented dev teams integrate storytelling into the game world itself outside of a note or a cassette. Red Dead Redemption 2 did a really great job of doing this in-world storytelling, and I think that's something our zombie game would have to include. Obviously, those who survive the apocalypse have to be colorful characters, so having a strong team of writers, like the stacked lineup at Telltale, to create an engrossing cast, whether they be good, bad, or somewhere in between, is important. With all that being said, this kind of rules out the possibility of having a true sandbox game with everything being procedurally generated. Perhaps a large pool of storytelling elements can be interspersed throughout a randomly generated world. Or perhaps it could work like Zomboid, where the maps are set but the loot and zombies are randomized. This allows for replayability value but still leaves room for good fleshed out storytelling. Of course, by keeping a more open sandbox style world, it's much more difficult to establish an overarching story or even final goal. But I like how games like State of Decay 2 and Zomboid work with there not being a set end goal aside from surviving. I think our game would benefit from the macro-micro style management of State of Decay 2. Starting out, our player would be solo, just themselves and nothing else, but as they gathered more followers or found a group to be with, they would need to start finding resources to keep going. A further possibility is we wouldn't even have to differentiate between finding rucksacks versus items like in State of Decay 2. Every month our group would need X amount of bandages or X amount of gas cans. Being able to delegate jobs for our group once we get settled into a base, akin to how RimWorld or Dwarf Fortress works, would allow even more customization and increase replayability even further. Having a resource drain system once a player is in a group brings on some challenges to counteract the advantage of having more people working with you. Now, you need to expand out and potentially go into more dangerous areas to keep the group together and running. On top of adding some dynamic difficulty, it allows players to play how they want, whether that be solo with less responsibility for others, or in a group where they have strength in numbers. As far as the zombies themselves, I'm going to make what I think Pepper Brooks would call a bold strategy, and say that I think the zombies should all be regular-ass zombies. I'm going to stand by what I said earlier about specials. I think that having special zombies both disarms the spookiness of a regular zombie horde and undermines them as enemies. Having nobody to fight but reanimated regular dead folks and regular living folks makes the world feel more visceral and personal. I'm not saying you can't have variation in the zombie designs. Saints and Sinners actually does this really well, with one of the special zombies being zombies in riot gear. As far as viruses reanimating dead people goes, that's perfectly plausible, but when the reanimated dead are 8.5 feet tall and wield concrete and rebar warhammers, it crosses the line of ridiculousness for me. I'm sure there's going to be plenty of other people who feel otherwise, but I'm going to stick to my guns on this one. Regular zombies add to the atmosphere just right. As far as the difficulty of handling the zombies goes, I think it would be wise to adapt the threat level that Zomboid gives them. Handling 1 or 2 at a time isn't bad, 3 to 4 is tough, and anything more than that and you're asking for trouble regardless of how far in you are. I would also want to incorporate how Zomboid handles zombie populations, with them most commonly being found in groups of 3 or 4, with the odd large horde that acts more as a force of nature for the player to avoid than to confront directly, at least at first. When scrounging the world for whatever it is our character needs, whether that be weapons, food, medicine, building supplies, we're sure to find all manner of objects. Recently, I played a game that I didn't cover in this list called Into the Radius. Best described as VR Stalker, this game features a method of inventory management that I haven't seen in any other game. Instead of a gridwork inventory like 99% of games, the actual 3D objects take up physical 3D space in your backpack. This makes inventory management 100 times more interesting because unlike in a game with a standard grid-based inventory, a bowling ball and a shotgun are not going to stack perfectly. Since I mainly wanted to point out this one small subsystem, I didn't put Into the Radius on the list, but I would definitely recommend trying it if you have VR and are a fan of the Stalker series. Finally, let's look at long-term gameplay. We've established that the game never really ends, unless our character dies obviously, so what happens when a player gets through that initial slog and is ready to start establishing themselves? Base building is something that not a lot of zombie games do, and that's a shame. I think that how a character gets by in the long term is just as interesting as how they handle that initial panicked opening rush to survive. I really enjoy how Zomboid handles long-term home management. If you want, you can inhabit a building that's already there, but that comes with some downsides. You may have to make renovations to make it truly secure, and if you pick a place too centrally located, you won't ever have peace from the zombies. Alternatively, you can build a new place from scratch, provided you have the required carpentry skills and building supplies. I like this system because it allows the player to pick a method of getting entrenched that fits where they are in terms of being equipped to survive the world around them. Starting out, you make do with what you can in an abandoned house or industrial building, but as time goes on and you get more independent, you can start to grow your roots outside of the zombie-infested towns. This gives you room to build elaborate base structures, farms, guard posts, and with time, you can be fully self-sufficient. As much as I enjoyed State of Decay 2, it was admittedly a bit of a letdown that you're limited to setting up shop in a pre-selected group of buildings. I think that letting the player make the decision for themselves on where they want to stay long-term gives a lot of flexibility, as well as adding to replayability value. With all that being said, I think it's time to summarize and wrap this up. I'm at page 22 for this script, which embarrassingly is the longest single thing that I've ever written. So, in short, our game is a first-person open world survival game with co-op functionality, has strong ambient storytelling and world building, features large mobile hordes with smaller isolated groups, incorporates resource drain when managing multiple characters and or bases, emphasizes slow, gritty, up-close melee combat versus the commonplace run-and-gun strategies, has a varied world from cities to countrysides and with landmarks interspersed between them, has NPCs that can be recruited to work with you, with the ability to designate them to certain roles should you want them to stay at a home or a base, and it supports open-ended base building so players can either move into existing structures or build new ones from scratch. Obviously, this list is not based in any sort of practical reality, and as I have neither expertise nor desire to be a game developer, it's not really my place to say, "Whoa, why hasn't this game been made yet?" I enjoy all of the games that I picked bits and pieces from, and I think that each one of them is unique and fun in their own way. All I really did was separate the bits I liked from the bits I didn't, and put them into a smorgasbord of features that I thought would make for a good zombie game. I'm sure that not everybody is going to agree with what I set out for this hypothetical game. I was actually hoping this would be the case at least. If you would change, add, or otherwise edit this list, let me know and tell me how you would build your ideal zombie game. Big thank you to all the creators who made the content I've sprinkled throughout in lieu of my own. Putting this video together has been an endeavor of its own, and I can't imagine going and getting the exact gameplay I'm looking for every single game I used. Any content that I used in this video that didn't come directly from me is linked and credited in the description. I've been debating doing longer style videos like these versus the shorter ones like those that I've already uploaded. If you have any strong opinions either way, let me know. Thanks for watching, and have a good New Year's. Bye!